Hey, hello everyone. Again, my name is Rose, and I am the community educator at Women's Advocates. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you are just joining. Again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to leave that in the chat. I would love to answer them as we go. But yeah, with that, as we dive into domestic violence 201 today, I just want to kind of start by talking about women's advocates as a whole and where we got to be and how we came to be. So, Women's Advocates is a nonprofit organization located in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we offer just a continuum of safety through our prevention and programs like giving webinars, emergency shelters, advocacy services, and housing stability services for victim survivors who are staying in our shelter. And we first began in the early 1970s as a legal helpline where a group of women were helping other women who were seeking divorce, because at the time you can't divorce somebody without, you know, any proper reasons. Sometimes divorces don't happen at all, um, because that just a lot of times divorcing people was kind of difficult and it was kind of frowned upon. And so a lot of these women who were seeking divorce from their husbands were seeking divorces because they were in a domestic violence situation and they were facing possible mortal danger. And so a lot of the women who were working this helpline quickly realized that and were able to kind of open up their houses, spare rooms, couches for a lot of these women and children to kind of stay in. And they soon realized that that was just not a sustainable plan at all. And so they had to do something more major. And so they bought their first house, again, located in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they are then able to house a lot of these women who were seeking divorces from their abusive husbands. And ever since then, it's been almost 50 years now. We will be celebrating our 50th year anniversary coming up here in October. But yeah, it's been 50 years since, and we now have three shelters connected in the St. Paul area. And we still are trying to serve and carry on this mission of trying to stop domestic violence. Um, but yeah, that's just a little bit about us. If you'd like to know more or read up about what we have going on within our org, feel free to visit our website. It's just womensadvocates.org. But yeah, you can see more about us, know what we have in store, sign up for different webinars we have coming up if you are interested in any of that. And then here is our land acknowledgement. I am going to see if I can copy and paste it into the chat in case anybody wants to see the full land acknowledgement. There we go. But I am going to read it out loud for us really quickly here. It says, Women's Advocates' work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people. Excuse me, y'all. Um, the area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risks of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to support tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. Again, the land acknowledgement is also copy and pasted into the chat. So if you'd like to um, visit our website and see what that's about, feel free to click the link in the chat. Hopefully it opens. Again, I'm not sure. Working with the new setup and everything, hopefully everything is working. All the links are working. If it's not, please let me know, and I'll see what I can do. But if it is working, then we are good to go. But today we have three parts within the Domestic Violence 201 presentation. Part one will be exploring coercive control and the impact of abuse. Part two why don't we believe victim survivors, and part 3, shifting the culture and what we can do differently. Before I move on, though, I would like to launch a poll. Let me see if it works. Perfect. If you can take that poll for me really quickly, I would highly appreciate that. It's just a basic question. What brings you here to this training, and what specifically are you hoping to learn about? This is a multiple choice question, so you can choose more than one answer. But again, no right or wrong answers. So I will give us a couple seconds to do that, and then I will share the results. Couple more seconds. Okay, thank you, everyone. This is what a lot of you said. Majority of you said expanding your understanding of abusive relationships. Again, no right or wrong answers, but it's just nice for me to kind of gauge and see where everybody is. Thank you so much for taking the poll. We will have a couple more as we go. So look forward to that. But thank you for taking that, and we can officially move on to part 1, exploring coercive control and the impact of abuse. So we just want to really quickly point out that domestic violence takes many forms, and all tactics on this list are aimed towards gaining power and control over the other person and taking away their sense of agency. And your sense of agency is a person's capacity to act independently and make their own free choices. So when we say emphasize the fact that domestic violence isn't just physical violence, you can see the entire list on the screen. What else can be done to be considered domestic violence? Sometimes you're not going through physical violence, but you are going through emotional and financial violence. And that would still fall under the umbrella of domestic violence. And we will still have to do our part to educate and help people understand that, but also help these victim survivors escape that situation if they are still in that. So, yeah, you will be hearing that a lot throughout these presentations, that domestic violence isn't just physical. And though we know that the physical part is a big part of domestic violence, we also want to acknowledge everything else, because a lot of times when we are speaking honestly here, when it comes to the law and everything else, people tend to overlook um, everything, and they tend to just focus on physical violence. So as we work with victim survivors, we do want to emphasize that fact. And domestic violence oftentimes is not just a one-time thing. Domestic violence is a 24/7 pattern designed to exert control over the other person and to exercise power in a way that makes the other person feel small, afraid, and unsafe in their own homes. It also involves using every tactic on the table here with the power control wheel to make the other person's world smaller and a lot more hostile. So common experiences of isolation, intimidation, denying, blaming, all of these are tactics used to kind of cause control over the other person, over the victim survivor. So again, this is something that you will be seeing a lot throughout this presentation and throughout a lot of our other presentations, the power and control wheel, and knowing how and what somebody can do to kind of exert that power over the victim survivors. And we cover a lot of that. The information I just talked about, we cover a lot of that in our domestic violence 101. Again, if you're interested in that, feel free to visit our website and sign up to be a part of that next time we give a presentation about it. But this is Domestic Violence 201, and we are jumping into coercive control. This is The main topic of today's webinar will be jumping and talking a lot about coercive control, just because we think that is something that's not often talked about, or it's something that's just not often understood. And so this whole presentation, we will be talking more about that. And as we do that, I want to launch another poll. So coming into this webinar, how familiar are you with the concept of coercive control? Please feel free to take that poll for me. But as you do that, I'm going to just talk a little bit more about coercive control. So a sociologist named Evan Stark popularized the concept of coercive control, which he explains in his book called CC, How Men Trap Women in Personal Life. Even with passages of violence against women's acts and increased criminalization of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, homicide rates were not going down. So Stark wondered why, and through his research of domestic violence responses, judicial systems responses, and insights from survivors and advocates, he was able to learn and realize that the anti-violence movements conceptualized of domestic violence was leaving out victim survivors who are most likely to be murdered by a partner. So the concept of coercive control was um, made popular and popularized by sociologist Evan Stark when he was doing all his research about domestic violence and why that is. I will give us a couple more seconds to take the poll. And once that's done, I will again share the results with everybody. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for taking that poll. Majority of answers says they've heard of it before, but they'd like to know more, or they'd like to refresh, which, thank you for being here. And absolutely, I hope that we're able to help you learn more about that. Some people have never heard of coercive control, and some people are very familiar with it. So this is good. Again, good for me to gauge where the audience is, as I am the host and facilitator of today's webinar, but thank you for taking that poll. And we're just going to jump into this part. So myths and facts. The presence of firearms is the most important risk factor for femicide, particularly if the man had threatened murder in the past. So we have the myth on the screen saying physical assault is the greatest indicator of future domestic violence homicide, when the fact is the presence of coercive control in a relationship is a more accurate predictor of lethality than physical or sexual violence alone. And when you are a victim survivor in a relationship going through coercive control, that is when the abusers when they are pushing this narrative onto you, or they are kind of, isolating you, again, abusing you in many, many ways other than just physical. Your judgment is clouded. You feel like you are unsafe all the time. You're in a very hostile environment, causing you to not know who you can turn to, where you can go. And so a lot of times, again, with the myth, physical assault is the greatest indicator of future domestic violence homicide. But we do want to kind of look deeper into this and see how coercive control plays a big part in that. So that again is tied in with Evan Stark's coercive control. Let me see if there is a link for me. I don't have a link on this specific Evan Stark book, but once we send out our follow-up email, I will be happy to include that in there, just so everybody can kind of take a look for themselves and learn a little bit more about that if they would like. But Coercive control can be wielded in a lot of different ways, usually falling into these categories. Destabilizing, so throwing them off balance to get them to ignore their instincts or red flags. You see this a lot in the beginning of relationships with something called love bombing. And this is to kind of gain trust and encourage dependence, making it harder for victim survivors to recognize what's happening is abuse and that it's harder to leave the relationship. And at first, controlling partners are usually attentive, romantic, and charming. Um, and they may be extraordinarily helpful, and possessiveness might sound flattering because a lot of times, a lot of stuff like jealousy and being possessive is normalized in the media when it comes to relationships. And people tend to think that it's just flattering or that this person feels that way because they love you. Um, but we, of course, want to emphasize that this could very much take a turn for the worse, and it could be falling under the umbrella of domestic violence. Um, Later, we have destabilization, and that might look like depriving victim survivors of sleep and keeping them up all night long so that they're unable to think clearly. A big one is isolation, separates the victim survivors from support systems, also ensuring that the victim survivor only hears what the abusive person says, or what they believe. And denial of outside perspectives that could help the victim survivor realize it's abusive relationship with an abusive partner, and stopping everybody from, again, outside of the relationship, trying to help the victim survivor leave the abusive relationship. So the victim survivor is now, again, falling victim to and is in control or is not in control of their own life. And the abuser is then able to control the victim survivor however they want. Monitoring. So this is when abusive people might force victim survivors to hand over passwords, monitoring their time online, tracking their movements with GPS. And in many cases, the abusive person will engage in stalking to ensure that the victim survivor is where they say that they are. And regulation includes deciding how a person will dress, how they will act, how much money they can spend, if they can spend any money at all, their diet, what they can eat, what they talk about. So basically forcing a victim survivor to act only in ways the abusive person deems acceptable. And then we have threats and physical intimidation. So abusive person will use intimidation or threats to compel a victim survivor to comply. Physical or sexual violence might be used to threaten the victim survivor, and it only takes one bruised arm, or one incident of forced sex for victim survivors to learn that it's easier, quote unquote, easier, and that quote unquote less harmful. And they would have to just do whatever this person wants them to do because, again, it's quote unquote easier. Um, and so, after one incident, victim survivors will always have the fear in their mind that the abusive person would and could hurt them like that again. And if they don't want to go through that, then they would just have to, again, comply to what the abusive person wants. And the idea of physical harm can be just as devastating as actual harm. So just thinking about being harmed in that way could be just as scary for victim survivors. And we, of course, I guess we all know what that feels like. And so coercive control is a tailored experience we talk about in Domestic Violence 101. And about being different from crime committed by a stranger because of the intimate relationship. So a lot of times when you are going through something like this, it is usually with somebody that you know intimately, somebody that you know that you grew up with, lived with, family members, or someone you are involved with intimately and romantically. And the person doing the harm has deep knowledge of the person that they're harming. So they can tailor their actions to be uniquely harmful in ways that a stranger would not know how. and actions that could seem really insignificant, trivial, even benign to someone outside the relationship are imbued with meaning or intent when looked at from the inside. So, women's experiences of coercive control is filled with gestures and other behavior cues um, that their astute sensitivity tells them are threatening but appears benign um, or unintelligible to outsiders. And sometimes we see this a lot too, working with victim survivors who come into our shelter, where certain things, you know, um, to a lot of the people on the outside, especially when we're talking about, again, the law, just being really honest, again, when we talk about the law and stuff, people see these relationships in coercive control as something that's not a big deal because they're not being physically harmed. They may not be physically harmed in any way, or again, because the abuser knows this person intimately, they are able to harm them in ways that other people on the outside might see and think like, hey, that's not a big deal, or you can get out of that, or you should just leave the relationship. If you don't like this person, you can just get up and leave. And of course, we would then know it's not that simple. We again cover a lot of this in our domestic violence 101, but just want to emphasize the fact again in this presentation and webinar, just because we always want to pass down that message that up and leaving your abusive relationship is not always that simple, and it's not always possible, and it's not the easier way out of the relationship. So it's usually not enough to ask someone, are you experiencing coercive control in your relationship? Because most people have no idea what it looks like. Which again brings me back to the poll. If you are very familiar with coercive control and what it looks like, then it may be easier, quote unquote, again, easier for you to work with victim survivors of domestic violence because now you have a better understanding of what coercive control looks like, and maybe you have a better understanding of what it's like to help them and to be able to help them, especially if other people around them don't see how severe and serious the issue is. So if you're concerned about someone you know and want to find out if they're safe in their relationship, questions like these that ask about specific abusive or controlling behaviors can be the most effective way to go about it. So all the questions on the screen are stuff that you can kind of ask, especially when you are talking about domestic violence with somebody who is going through it. It might be hard to bring up the subject. And it's a heavy subject too, so it might be hard to kind of just talk through that. So feel free to keep these questions in mind and ask them if you ever feel like you want to know if somebody you know is safe in their relationship. And the only way we can ever find out is if we are honest and if we are asking. There we go. There we go. Um, and then on this slide, we have the impacts of coercive control. So this is what can happen to victim survivors who have had their freedoms diminished or erased through coercive control. Diminished social life is the victim survivor. If the victim survivor tries to spend time with others, the abusive person objects or makes it very difficult for them to be able to hang out or spend time with anybody outside of the relationship. So the victim survivor ends up living a diminished social life, again, falling into isolation. We have annihilation of self, so silencing of opinions because of the abusive partner becomes upset. The victim survivor gives in to the abusive person's decisions because it just doesn't seem worth disagreeing with them. Again, with the whole, it's easier to just comply. Um, and the survivor becomes afraid to kind of make waves and share their opinions and talk freely about anything in the relationship because the abuser is in control. They might get upset or they will start arguments. And so the victim survivor will then feel like it's better to just be quiet and to kind of just comply with whatever the abusive person wants. So a lot of times the victim survivor ends up silencing themselves and their self-esteem tends to plummet as they are subjected to frequent criticism. Again, a really big issue, of course, when it comes to coercive control. Because when the victim survivor is now silencing themselves, they then are losing their confidence and just a lot more than that. And so now, as people who are working with victim survivors, we want to get that up and running again, but it's really, really hard and it takes a long time. It takes a lot of time for victim survivors to get back to where they're at, to gain that confidence and to be able to make decisions for themselves again. We have the loss of agency. So when we mix violence and coercion, you have a condition of unfreedom. So not being able to, again, speak your mind, not being able to be yourself. And now you are constantly in a state of fear and a reminder to what we talked about earlier. Presence of coercive control is a more accurate prediction of lethality than physical or sexual violence alone. And the core injustice of coercive control is this. Survivors feel like prisoners in their own homes. Their power is taken from them and they don't get to make any decisions about their own lives. And those decisions are made by someone who wishes them to be small, obedient, and afraid. So no good intentions, no good motives. Again, a quote from Evan Stark, the person who popularized coercive control, integrating his standpoint into her self-esteem so that self-respect and self-soothing comes from the standards set by the person who is hurting them. And on the screen, it says, so many days, my work has no end. I was a prisoner. My life was his. Coming from a survivor of coercive control, knowing the impact of coercive control. And most of the harms involved in coercive control are gendered specific infringements of adult autonomy that are currently invisible to the law. So again, talking a little bit more about the law and how sometimes it's just not on the side of victim survivors. So as advocates, we need to do what we can in order to better understand domestic violence, better understand coercive control, in order to better support victim survivors. So on the screen really are just more about the law. So no federal laws in the US criminalizing coercive control. Again, bringing us back to what we just talked about a little bit earlier, from the outside perspective, people who are going through coercive control might feel like they don't have anybody to rely on because people from the outside perspective think it's not a big deal or they don't really understand what coercive control is or what it looks like. And again, that's where we come in, and we are able to then educate and talk more about this in order to better support victim survivors. So on the screen, we have a question. What are potential problems or barriers that victim survivors might face when trying to seek justice from coercive control? If you'd like, you can leave that into the chat. If you'd like to kind of just think about it to yourself for a second, feel free to do that too. But I think I have some links that I would like to copy and paste into the chat just so people can have more resources on their hands. They're not on this slide, my apologies. But yeah, a lot of these resources will be shown at the end. So as we reach, we're not at the end yet, but as we reach the end, feel free to look out for that. But again, with the question on the screen, feel free to answer that in the chat or kind of just think about it to yourself. I'll let you kind of look at it again. What are potential problems or barriers that victim survivors might face when trying to seek justice? because in order to better help victim survivors, we need to understand these barriers. And with that, we're going to jump into part two of why don't we believe? So, quick disclaimer, survivors shouldn't have to quote unquote earn belief. I'm not saying that there's anything a survivor could or should do to be believed better, to make their story more believable, and not blaming survivors for the fact that we live in a culture of silence and minimalization. So, um, yeah, no part of this next section is meant to suggest that victim survivors is at fault for not being believed or taken seriously. If anything, we want to come up with solutions for this so victim blaming can stop, and we can educate everybody else to understand why they should believe survivors and their stories. So another question is, why do victim survivors stay silent? Why don't they say anything? Or when they do finally speak up, why are you speaking up now, right? Especially if years have gone by, people ask us all the time, why are you speaking up now? If you really cared, if this really happened, why didn't you say something sooner? Why are you silent? And we just want to talk more about that in this next part here. So, victims are often automatically accused of lying whenever they are sharing their story. This is not uncommon at all with victim survivors of domestic violence. But when a perpetrator is exposed of lying, the stigma doesn't stick. Um, and we want to know, why is that? We're wary of victims making false accusations, but really consider how many abusers have blatantly lied about and downplayed or manipulated others to cover up their own actions. So, believe women or believe survivors is not just like believe us at all cost, but don't investigate, if I say it, then it's true, stuff like that. Um, we do, of course, want to be able to talk freely with victim survivors, allow victim survivors to share their experiences and their stories, and we want to be able to believe them. And we don't immediately want to jump into this victim blaming mindset, but let's start with a premise that people aren't lying, and at least give them the respect of interrogating what they're trying to say. And by believing survivors, we are helping create a safe space for them to kind of step up and talk about their stories and consequently heal. Again, when you are in a domestic violence relationship like this, um, you tend to lose that confidence and you silence yourself, and then you're not used to speaking up anymore. You're not used to sharing your stories. And so when the victim survivors are able to kind of gain that courage to talk about their situations, we want to be able to listen carefully, and we want to be able to support and believe what they are saying about their situation. Um, and of course, we also want to approach this in ways that don't put our safety into jeopardy too. That is something that we always emphasize here at Women's Advocates. If you're ever working with a victim survivor, and if you ever have to talk with this person who is abusive, you want to be able to keep yourself safe. So by believing them, by not believing victim survivors, excuse me, you are discouraging people from talking about their stories, and hence contributing to the toxic mindset and atmosphere, which aids perpetrators. So we do not want to echo the voice of abusers. We want to be able to think for ourselves and be able to believe and help victim survivors in any way that we can. We then have credibility. So internalized credibility discounts, asking things like, did it really happen? Was it really abuse? Um, Survivors, like everyone else, are implanted in a culture that overlooks or trivializes harm to women. So if you don't see what is happening, If you don't see what happened to you as wrong, um, as worthy of concern, then you're not going to come forward. And a lot of times, victim survivors tend to downplay their experiences because they don't think it was, that bad, even if it was terrible. Or they know the impact of domestic violence, of what they went through. They know it's bad. They know it's um, that they were in a state of mortal danger, but they still tend to downplay it, or they think they can't hold space or take up space in places because they just don't feel like they are worthy of that time and worthy of the help. And we always, always, always want to be able to help victim survivors in any way that we can and let them know that that is not the case and that they are able to share their stories, they will be believed, and that they are able to take up space and do that whenever they can, however much they can. But when you feel that way so much as a victim survivors, you're going to stay silent. You tend to stay silent. You've probably stayed silent so long, um, and you're used to that now. And so it's hard to speak up. And so when we try to get out of this victim blaming mindset and we are able to then better support victim survivors, we are encouraging them to share their stories. And that doesn't mean that they have to, go out in public and share it with everyone, and be on news stations and everything. Maybe they just want to have a private conversation with an advocate, with a therapist, somebody who can have sympathy and talk with them about their situation. And whatever the case may be, we want to be able to provide that to them. So think about recent high-profile lawsuits and court cases. Where have you seen the credibility complex in action? And nowhere is the credibility complex more evident or visible than in sexual assault trials and accusations of sexual violence or misconduct. So, again, in the chat or quietly to yourself, if you'd like, whatever you are comfortable with, you think of examples of the credibility complex in action. If you would like a refresher, I can go back to this slide. So, on the screen, it says credibility complex, legal and cultural forces that contribute to discounted credibility for accusers, inflated credibility for accused. Internalized credibility discount, that is the victim survivors minimize, dismiss their own experiences of abuse. So, and again, a lot of these sources will be at the end of the presentation and be sent out to you afterwards. So if you would like to read more about this, you are able to do so afterwards. But yeah, if you can, write in the chat if you'd like to kind of just think about it. If you simply don't know, that's fine too. It's good for me to know. So who is credible? The credibility complex compounds vulnerabilities, and those who are marginalized on a variety of fronts are seen as less credible, less believable. And abusers understand this and often target victims who are less likely to disclose their abuse. And they will use mental health coercion, a form of abuse that targets a victim survivor's mental health diagnosis, to kind of undermine a survivor's credibility to others, and most dangerously to the survivor themselves. I think we see this sometimes, whether you've seen this in real life or maybe in the media with movies and TV shows that you may watch, somebody who is going through a lot and they probably take medications and stuff for whatever they are going through mentally, emotionally. And when somebody is abusing them, and when the victim survivor tries to reach out for help, the abuser will say, well, this person hasn't taken their meds. They're a little tired today. They didn't do so and so, and the doctor instructed that they should do this and that, and they haven't been keeping up, and now they're delirious. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. And so everybody around them would think that the victim survivor is this crazy person who shouldn't be believed, because the abuser is, of course, then able to use this to kind of weaponize and put this victim survivor in a tough spot. And this happens a lot in real life too. Again, you might see it in movies all the time and TV shows, but it also happens a lot in real life. And so we do want to be we do want to be able to kind of think about that, if that's ever something that you have come across or somebody that you've worked with has ever gone through something like that. We want to be able to um, understand why that is and what we can do to help if somebody is ever in that situation. So the emotional impacts of coercive control results in personality and cognitive changes that diminishes a victim survivor's credibility in the public eye. So kind of courts weigh appeals for sympathy against the type of person the defendant is imagined to be, particularly if a serious crime is involved. Victim survivors are especially vulnerable in this respect because their behavior um, exhibited under stress often suggest character flaws that seem incompatible with their worth, with their being a worthy victim of domestic violence. And this would again go into what we talked about a little bit earlier, again, where victim survivors don't necessarily have to prove their pain or showcase what they've been through to kind of gain and earn your trust. We want to be able to listen to their stories. And we want to be able to believe them and support them in any way that we can. And a lot of times, when victim survivors don't get that support, especially when it comes to the law, they are kind of forced to then, show their pain and show what they've been through. And it can be really hard and triggering for victim survivors. So, mm, okay, all is working well. Sorry. Again, this new setup. Perfect. And we have this slide. So barriers to beliefs. The first two barriers are intertwined. We're conditioned to be skeptical when survivors come forward. And when we enter the field of advocacy, whether on purpose or otherwise, we have to unlearn that conditioning. And we're socialized to ask questions, to doubt. There's a reason for why people are like this, why we are like this, because our default is doubt, because we don't want to believe that it could happen to us or that something so terrible is actually happening to somebody out there. And admitting that it happens to others like us means admitting that it could happen to us, shattering the idea that we are immune or safe from domestic violence. And a lot of times, again, growing up with this mindset, it's just kind of hard to believe victim survivors, which is why we must, again, educate and be able to unlearn these things in order to get rid of that victim blaming mindset. So we have, again, on the slide, barriers to beliefs. So our default is to doubt, and believing shatters our sense of security. Myths about perfect victims or monster perpetrators. I think this is something that's oftentimes not talked about enough because anybody could be a victim, anybody could be a perpetrator. But in our minds or in the media, we see a certain type of victim. So a woman, but not just any woman, a small, fragile woman is oftentimes the victim. And then we would see a man, a big, strong, tall man who is the perpetrator all the time. And so seeing all of this, our mind starts to believe like, hey, we have the quote unquote perfect victim, and now we have the quote unquote monster perpetrators. But we also want to, again, get rid of that mindset, unlearn all of that, and understand that anybody can be a victim, anybody can be a perpetrator, and that there's no perfect victim, there's no perfect image for a perpetrator. We have misconceptions about the nature of abuse. People just don't understand what abuse looks like, what falls under the umbrella of abuse. This takes us back to understanding and knowing that domestic violence isn't just physical. Sometimes simply, not simply, but verbal violence can be domestic violence too. But people will say, Like, well, you weren't hit and this person didn't physically harm you, so it probably wasn't, as serious. Um, and we don't ever want to wait for things to start to escalate. And we don't want to wait for somebody to end up getting hit, right? Or end up getting physically assaulted in any way for us to take it seriously. We want to believe and hear their stories and be able to help in any way that we can. So yeah, misconceptions about the nature of abuse is also a big barrier as to why people tend to not believe victim survivors. And we are conditioned to keep peace. A lot of times we're told to kind of mind our business. We're told to, not rock the boat, not do anything like that. And so we tend to not speak up. We tend to not do anything to help victim survivors if they ever needed it. And caring about survivors is destabilizing. That is another barrier to deep beliefs. And all of these sometimes coming together makes it really hard for victim survivors to reach out to anybody if they ever need help because they probably know that they won't be believed. So jumping into part 3, shifting the culture. What can we do differently? I'm going to launch a poll here. And as you all take, I will then share a little bit more. Let me see if I can launched it. So, what keeps you from speaking up when you hear misogynistic jokes, victim blaming comments, or misconceptions about abuse? This is again multiple choice. So, feel free to choose as many on the screen as you'd like. All I ask is that you be honest. I will not know who is taking the poll, but I do ask that we are honest. And if there are other reasons that you can think of, feel free to leave them in the chat. I would like to know what everybody is thinking. But as a community, we can all be involved in violence prevention and intervention in our own unique ways. So on the screen here, you'll find many different options and actions that you can take to kind of contribute to a community and hopefully one day a world free of domestic violence. It's going to be a long, long road and a long, long fight, but we want to be able to help victim survivors in any way that we can and fight against domestic violence in any way that we can. So again, believe survivors who come forward about their abuse, educating about consent and healthy relationships, always, always a good thing to do. Coming to more webinars. It doesn't have to be with us at Women's Advocates. It could be anywhere that you can find to kind of just educate yourself or educate those around you about domestic violence. Always a good idea to speak out when we hear these victim blaming, misogynistic jokes and comments, to show up to those who do need us and to kind of rewire ourselves to respond to disclosures of abuse more fairly. Again, unlearning the victim blaming mindset. And of course, taking care of yourself however you need when you're coming across these issues. Give us a couple more seconds here to take the poll, and then I'm going to share our results. Okay, thank you for taking the poll. I'm going to end it now. And no right or wrong answers here, but the majority of you said discomfort with conflict. A lot of people also said social norms against correcting strangers. So again, falling under the whole you must mind your business. If you don't want to be in danger, um, don't speak up, don't do anything. And of course, discomfort with conflict. I think as human beings, we all understand, right? That sometimes you can't just jump in and do the right things, even if you know it's the right thing to do, helping victim survivors, or even other things in life where you would have to face conflict in order to better a situation. So I absolutely understand. If you have a discomfort with conflict and you tend to kind of not speak up about these things, um, But we do, of course, want to be able to educate further um, about coercive control and victim blaming mindsets so we can kind of unlearn um, these ways and be able to speak up for ourselves, even if we are ever in these situations. But we do have answers just all across the board. There's not a single blank answer. We have freeze responses, not knowing what to say, speaking up isn't popular. Um, but yeah, we have answers all across the board, but the one with the most um, votes is discomfort with conflict. Thank you, everyone, for taking that poll. Again, just good for me to know. So, socialized to kind of protect our sensibilities rather than to protect survivors. What keeps us silent? These are the answers from the poll that we just took. If again, if you feel comfortable, feel free to type down your answers in the chat, or you can kind of just think about it to yourself. But have you ever spoken up or spoken out in response to a victim blaming comment or a misconception about abuse? What was the situation? How did it go? And I think this would be good to know if anybody has been in a situation like this. And if you've never been in a situation like this, how would you approach something like that now? Um, or are you still very much, having a discomfort with conflict? I know it's not easy. Um, but yeah, I would like to hear somebody's story if they have one. I am moving on to the next slide, but if you are typing, feel free to keep doing so, or you can simply kind of again think to yourself, like, has that ever happened before? What did you do? Or have you ever seen somebody else step in and did something? How did that go for them? So again, breaking down the doubt, start by believing. This takes work to make a habit out of it. And our default is super ingrained, and we have to actively participate in changing it. So, why it's important to believe our loved ones out loud, because belief begins at home. And a lot of times, if you know anybody who is going through an abusive relationship, believing them at home first can do a lot for them. Before they even reach us as advocates to offer them the help that they need. But a lot of times, those who are closest to them, family, friends, people that they love, believing them will go a long way. And when a loved one dismisses an allegation, it decreases the already slim odds that a victim survivor will pursue a formal report. So it really starts at home. Um, But yeah, breaking down the doubts on the screen, um, being able to kind of believe victim survivors in their situation, um, knowing what to say. If you don't really know what to say, I think the responses on the screen are also very helpful. So saying things like, I have no idea, how did that start? Um, what did you do in response? But saying something like, I believe you, and I'm sorry that happened to you. Sometimes it doesn't take something super profound. You don't need to say something super profound and deep to be able to support victim survivors. Just simply being there, telling them that you believe in them, will do a lot, trust. We then, of course, have myths. We've been talking about some of it throughout this presentation, but the idea that accusers who do not leave their abusers aren't victims, or that abusers who um, recently who also take away their testimony or return to their abusers were lying. We again touch based on this in a lot of our presentations, the barriers to leaving, why a lot of times victim survivors would take back what they say in order to go back to the abuser, or why they have escaped. They're now in shelter, they're now living with somebody else, and they're quote unquote safe, but they would make the decision to go back to the abuser or to go back to this relationship. And it can be a little being friends and family members, I understand how it can be a little frustrating to see that, or it can be worrisome to kind of see that. But there are many, many barriers as to why a victim survivor cannot leave, um, and why they would choose to go back to their abuser. And a lot of times that doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying about their situation. They certainly could be going through everything that they said they were going through, but they have really no choice but to go back because I think people are also very much stuck in this mindset where it's like, why don't you just leave the relationship, right? If you're going through this and that, you can just up and leave, grab yourself, grab your kids, walk out the door right now. But what we want to emphasize and tell everybody is when a victim survivor is leaving an abusive relationship, that is the most dangerous time for the victim survivor. As if being in the relationship, going through everything that they're going through, isn't dangerous enough. If they were to really up and leave, that is the most dangerous time for a victim survivor. So it's never easy to just up and go, like what everybody else is saying. And we want to understand that. We want to emphasize that message and let everybody know, like, hey, it's not just grabbing your stuff and go. You could be putting yourself in danger. You could be putting your kids in mortal danger. You could be putting everybody in danger. And that's not to victim blame, but it's just the truth that this person could very much escalate and things can get really, really bad and ugly from here on out. And so when we do want to help victim survivors escape their situation, we want to be able to do it correctly. We want to be able to do it safely and make sure that everybody is safe and that they are away from this person, and that if this person were to escalate or do anything crazy, that it would not harm the victim survivor and their children and their pets. So breaking down misconceptions. And misconceptions, excuse me, about the nature of abuse. Purely physical, something you'd have to notice. Again, when people take victim survivors seriously about their abuse, it's usually if they see the bruises, if they see the cuts, if they see all the physical pain that's been caused on them, that's when they'll probably take it seriously and question why this person is doing what they're doing, or even then, um, people will get into the victim blaming mindset immediately of, oh, this is happening to you. We clearly see all the terrible thing that's been happening to you because physically we can see it. It's on your arms, it's on your body, it's on your face, the cuts, the bruises, everything. So now, instead of believing the victim survivors and their story and trying to support them in the ways that they can, they immediately go into the victim blaming mindset of, oh, well, if this is really happening, if it's that bad, why didn't you just leave? Which then ties me back to what I was talking about in the last slide, where it's not easy to just up and leave that situation and their partner. So when we break down these misconceptions, um, we want to be able to understand why victim survivors tend to not speak up about their situations, or why they won't leave their relationships even if it gets really, really terrible. So when you hear stories like these on the screen, I can read one out for you if that's helpful. This one right here says, the second one says, if things were really that bad, how come I didn't notice? If there was abuse, I definitely would have seen something. If you were to hear something like this, a response to that would be maybe, maybe not. So many survivors stay quiet about abuse, and there's not always physical evidence to see. Not noticing doesn't make you a bad friend, it means the abuse was hidden. And a lot of times people would wait for them to see a physical abuse inflicted upon the victim survivor in order to really believe, or to even then probably believe the victim survivor in their situation. So yeah, it's really our job to believe victim survivors and their stories, and to understand if they don't talk about their situation, or when they finally talk about it, um, to not come up with all these doubt and all these different stories that you have, about why they didn't tell you sooner. Um, but we simply just want to let them be able to um, tell their story when they are ready and to be able to be there and support them whenever we can, however we can. So this is a permission slip. We hereby release you from politeness. If you are scared of conflict, if you are uncomfortable with conflict, we now want to encourage you to not be so polite all the time, especially if you are dealing with someone who is abusive. You do not have to keep quiet to keep the peace, and you're able to cause trouble, to make a scene, to say something in order to protect someone. And this, again, does not mean that you put your own safety in jeopardy. Please do not do that. We do not want that. However, if you ever um, find that courage to kind of speak up for a victim survivor, we do highly encourage it because it goes a long way. Working with victim survivors, you have no idea what it means to them when you stand up for them, when you believe them, when you speak up for them when they aren't able to. Um, it goes a long way and it's helpful, and you don't actually understand what that does to their confidence in the long run. Because victim survivors will remember those times when somebody stepped up and helped them. They will remember you if you ever do that. Um, so yeah, permission slip to stop being so polite and to kind of, you know, be able to speak up if you ever can. Make noise, cause trouble, make people uncomfortable. If there is abuse going on, why would you want to keep the peace when you have every right to speak up and tell the truth and believe victim survivors and their stories? So tips and tools for cultural change. You can make a pact with a pal. You can keep it simple, you can script it out, and you can remember why you're doing this. What is the reason why you would want to help a victim survivor? Um, but yeah, if it makes it easier to have somebody on your side, on your team, right there with you, wanting change and being able to um, gather up that bravery to fight for the change, feel free to do that if it makes it easier. It is easier when you have somebody on your side. And a lot of times, victim survivors don't have somebody on their side to help and support them. So in any way that you can, if you'd like, feel free to um, come up with any sort of tips and tools to kind of make it easier for you the next time if you were to ever see something like this. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be facing an abuser in a situation like this. Maybe you hear like a joke, like a misogynistic joke, something, a homophobic joke, something of the sort that's not really funny at all. And you want to speak up about it, you want to say something, you can absolutely, you have every right to do that too. And we encourage you to do that. But um, every one of us has the ability to kind of shift our culture from automatic victim blaming and minimizing to centering, validating, and belief and autonomy of victim survivors and valuing consent, respect, and compassion. So yeah, with that, we want to be able to better our community by helping victim survivors. And on the quote, it says a positive response from close and extended members of the community can help restore a sense of control and security, which is critical to healing. And again, when you do kind of speak up, when you simply just stop the victim blaming mindset, and if you're able to speak up and help victim survivors of domestic violence, that will help them on their healing journey in more ways than you can imagine. Again, they will remember it, they will remember you, and they will highly, highly appreciate your help if you're ever able to help them. So these are just resources available in Minnesota specific, if you are in Minnesota, or national and international. We have hotlines, um, websites, we have further readings. We have some book recommendations. I'm going to copy and paste them into the chat about domestic violence. Feel free to check that out. Again, please let me know if these links are working, if you're able to open them. we have our online survivor support group. We are reaching the end of the webinar today. Thank you so much for being here. But we do have a online survivor support group open to all. If you know anybody who's interested, feel free to tell them about us and we will be in touch with them. Come see us at Pop-Up Advocacy. We have 2 different locations that we visit. Come talk to us about domestic violence. If you ever need any resources, anything at all, feel free to find us at these places, and we would be more than happy to talk with you about domestic violence. And we have a short survey if you would like to fill this out after the webinar. As you close out, I'm sure you'll see this survey too. If you'd like, feel free to fill that out. But for making it through with me, for sticking it to the end with me, you now deserve all the slides, the certificates, everything of the sort. So I will be copy and pasting it all into the chat. Feel free to stick around for just 1 more minute here while I put all of that into the chat. The slide, well, the link I just put into the chat right now is the DV201 slides. If you ever want to revisit what we just went through and you want to look over a slide, feel free to do that. It's in the chat. If you can open it, that would be great. And the one thing that everybody wants and everybody is waiting for is a certificate of attendance. Of course, of course. I will be copying, pasting that into the chat. There you go. That is the certificate of attendance. Again, please let me know if you can open it. Thank you, everybody. You're welcome, everyone. But yeah, all the links are in the chat, the slides, the certificates. Hopefully you can access it. Feel free to type your name and date and everything into the chat, not the chat, into the certificate. Print it out, keep it. It's yours now for sticking with me all the way to the end. But thank you, everybody, for being here. And yeah, feel free to scan the QR code on the screen if you want to download the presentation, if that makes it easier for you. But thank you, everybody, for being here. And I hope you have a great day. Hope to see you all again in a different webinar. If you ever want to be part of this again, feel free to sign up on our website. I would love to see some familiar names as I continue to give these presentations. Thank you, everyone, for being here.